Empower People works for disadvantaged women who are victims or potential victims of violence, including domestic violence, honor crimes, killing and trafficking or other type of slavery, and provides them shelter, proper counseling, legal support and other help required. The community work involves creating awareness and conducting livelihood programs.
Good evening and welcome to Empower People webinars. My name is Hridaya Ajgaonkar. Before I introduce our session and our speaker for today, I would like to issue a trigger warning for mentions of abuse and sexual violence, especially for individuals that we define as children. So our session today is a part of a series called Gender Today, and it is called Understanding Child Sexual Abuse and Busting Common Myths about CSA, that is Child Sexual Abuse. Our speaker for this evening is Aakanksha Kulkarni. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to advise viewer discretion because this session is not an introductory session that is meant for children, but rather for young adults and adults who want to understand child sexual abuse better. So if there are any children watching, I would like to request their parents to exercise their discretion and decide if this is an appropriate platform or if this is an appropriate first introduction to child sexual abuse and for their children. Let's meet our speaker for the evening. So our speaker is Aakanksha Kulkarni. She has graduated in psychology from the University of Mumbai and has a master's in social work with a specialization in mental health from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. She has worked in the field of implementation research on suicide, on women and children affected by domestic violence, as well as child abuse. She's also currently working on citizen participation and advocacy on gender, child protection, and of course, multiple issues concerning the rights of the urban poor. Aakanksha's talk will be followed by a panel discussion with Ayushi Gandhi, who we have met in the last session. Ayushi is a professional social worker with a specialization in public health. She has been working on various issues related to nutrition, education, and livelihood with women and children. She has also worked closely with tribal communities in Odisha. Before I hand the floor over to Aakanksha for her talk, I would like to mention that we will be flashing helplines throughout this video. So in case anybody wishes to contact any of these help centers for their experiences, they should not hesitate to do so. So Aakanksha, I would like to invite you to begin your talk, please. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Hridaya. Thank you for the introduction. And yes, for the trigger warning as well, because not just for children, but also because when we might be talking when we're talking about child sexual abuse, somebody who's watching this might also undergo any kind of re-traumatization. So if you do feel like you're not doing well after that, you can always access those lessons. So child sexual abuse is actually something that is very often is something that we read in newspapers, and it's not a narrative that we're unaware of. It's just that people don't really know what exactly it entails, what it is, and in its entirety. And also there are a lot of myths and a lot of misconceptions around child sexual abuse as a phenomena in general. And I think today we'll be addressing that. Next slide. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, so today we're going to do an overview on a few areas. So basically the entire talk is divided into these areas. The first is we're going to try to understand what child sexual abuse is. The next one. How prevalent is child sexual abuse is a question that people don't really ask, and this information is very important for us to understand how serious the issue is. Next one. What does it constitute? What does child sexual abuse in its entirety constitute is something we're also going to touch upon today. What does it look like? What does child sexual abuse, or for that matter, what does a perpetrator look like? Warning signs of child sexual abuse. The next one, cultural context of child sexual abuse. When we look at child sexual abuse from the cultural context that we belong to, is also something that we'll be seeing, and the impact of child sexual abuse on development of the individual who has undergone child sexual abuse. And I think the last one is myths pertaining to child sexual abuse. So this is basically an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. Next one. So when we talk about what child abuse, what child sexual abuse is, we have to look at the definition of a child. A child is legally any individual below the age of 18 years. Anyone, irrespective of gender, below the age of 18 years is considered as a child. There are different laws that have different definitions for the legal age of a child. For example, child marriage has a different age. So we basically stick to this as an overarching theme, which brings me to the next point. Uh, which is basically the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. The UNCRC is a charter that basically lists the rights of children across the world. What are the rights that children deserve to have? Which is a very important thing to understand, because all of our laws pertaining to children uh, have to in some way encompass the charter that India has ratified. Next one. Child rights basically has many domains. Children have different kind of rights. The first is survival rights, there's development rights, there are protection rights, there are participation rights. These are basically for the, please don't continue with this slide, please wait for a minute. These are basically different rights that we have to look at when we look at child rights as a general concept. When we speak of child sexual abuse, now can we move to the next one? When we speak of child sexual abuse majorly comes under protection rights, because protection rights basically say that every child has the right to be protected from any kind of violence, abuse, or discrimination or exploitation. In layman's terms, there is a definition. So when we speak of child sexual abuse, we majorly speak from the point of view of child protection to a great extent. Can we move? When we speak of prevalence of child sexual abuse, it is oftentimes people don't know how common child sexual abuse is. So as many as 109 children were sexually abused every day in India in 2018, according to the NCRB report, which basically documents all of the crime related statistics in the country. And it showed a 22% jump in cases from the previous year. Can we move to the next one? According to the recently released NCRB data, it shows 32,608 cases were reported in 2017 and 39,827 cases were reported in 2018 under the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act. The POCSO Act is the act that encompasses all of the aspects that come under protecting the child from child sexual abuse. This is a law that in itself is an entirely different conversation that which we will have hopefully in the coming sessions. So this is the law that under which these cases have been reported, and if you notice, there has been a significant increase in the number of changes in the number of cases over the year. But we still feel like that is not enough. Can we move to the next one? Can you move to the as many as 21,605 child rapes were recorded in 2018, which included 21,401 rapes of girls and 204 of boys, as per the data. Next one. Praja is an NGO that is working in Mumbai and I think across a lot of cities in different states in the country. They released a paper. It's a very interesting paper on policing and law and order in Mumbai. which states that most victims of rape cases registered in the previous financial year were minors. So of all of the cases of rape that were registered in Mumbai, nine a huge 90% rape cases registered in the movement were minors. So of all the cases, I'm so sorry, of all the cases that were registered, a majority of the cases were abuse that rape that has happened with minors, and 90% of these children who were abused knew the perpetrator who had abused them. Next one. So if we look at, this is basically a table to show the trends. Can we see the next? So if you look at the number of cases registered under POCSO, can you please move to the next point? If you see the number of cases registered under the POCSO Act, there definitely has been an increase from 2015 to 16 to 17. You can see the percentage in the statement. The above cases include penetrative sexual assault, sexual harassment against male and female children below the age of 18. If we look at this number, you will see that there is clearly a distinction in the total number of cases registered by for males and females, which is also something that is very interesting to look at, because male cases of child sexual abuse that happen with male children are mostly reported very less. And also another thing is that we see an gradual increase in the number of cases, which is also in a way a good thing, because it means that cases are being reported and they're not being kept hidden. Because when we see that 891 cases happened in 2015, 891 cases were registered, that does not mean that there were a lot of other cases that happened but weren't registered. So this is also something that we need to look at. Next slide. Yeah, so this table is taken from the paper of Praja. Now, when we look at what child sexual abuse constitutes, in my experience working with people who are survivors of child sexual abuse, especially in different capacities, I have noticed a lot of them telling me that, because there was no penetration, and because nobody had sex with me, I don't think I was sexually abused as a child, which is not true, because a lot of aspects of sexual abuse are not considered as sexual abuse due to lack of conversation around it. So to sum up basic points of what it encompasses, they are exhibitionism or exposing oneself to a minor. So basically, there are sexual offenses that are contact offenses and non-contact offenses, which basically means that the perpetrator doesn't necessarily have to be in physical contact with the child for the abuse to be sexual. So that includes exhibitionism, exposing oneself to a minor, fondling. Can we move? Intercourse, uh, masturbation in the presence of a minor, or forcing the minor to masturbate, obscene phone calls, text messages, or digital interactions, even like sending pictures to minors or asking minors to send pictures to you is also sexual abuse. Producing, owning, or sharing of pornographic images or movies that have children in them. Sex of any kind with a minor, including vaginal, oral, or anal. There is also another kind of penetrative sex that is called digital sex, which basically means fingering. That is also very properly demarcated as a form of sexual abuse. And also sex trafficking. Using children for commercial sexual exploitation is also a very neglected aspect of child sexual abuse, which again in itself is a whole conversation that one can have for hours. Any other sexual conduct that is harmful to a child's mental, emotional, or physical welfare also constitutes as child sexual abuse. We can move. So, what does, I am so sorry, just a second. What does child sexual abuse look like? What does a perpetrator look like? The majority of perpetrators are definitely somebody the child knows, has access to, trusts, and is a person of authority in the child's life. Next one. And like we saw in the previous statistics, that 90% of the children who were raped knew their perpetrator. A perpetrator does not have to be an adult to harm a child. This is something that is often not spoken about, and is again a conversation in its own capacity, because this includes children who also sexually abuse children. There is a completely different law for it, for the Juvenile Justice Act, and there are multiple things that come into play here, which is again a completely huge conversation in itself. The person can have any relationship with the child. The person can be a nanny, the person can be a friend, the person can be a sibling, and under the law, they are all capable of abusing that child. Next one. Child sexual abuse is the result of abusive behavior that takes advantage of a child's vulnerability and is in no way related to the sexual orientation or also the gender of the person who is abusing the child. This is something that we need to, that is a very important point, that the person who's a perpetrator does not, it does not matter what their gender is, it does not matter what their sexual orientation is. They, if reported, they can all be perpetrators of the child. Abusers can manipulate victims to stay quiet about the sexual abuse using a number of different tactics, which is also why child sexual abuse does not go reported. Because since that person, majority of cases is a person of trust and a person they know or authority, the person has the chance to manipulate the child into believing that, hi, this happens, it's very normal, or threatening the child, or threatening to hurt the parents of the child, etc. They might tell the child that the activity is normal or that they enjoyed it, and try and gain consent from the child for the activity. Next one. An abuser may make threats if the child, yeah, so basically using threats, using manipulation, telling the child that, threatening the child with their own life or parents' life, or the threat of being disowned by their family once they find out, or also the fact that they try to sexually pleasure the child, or try to build a pleasure relationship with the child, basically. Okay, next one. Child sexual abuse is not only a physical violation, it is a violation of the child's trust and the child's autonomy over themselves. So this is also a very important point when we have to look at the consequence of abuse on the child. When the child grows up over time, this has a huge impact in their psychological, interpersonal development as an adult. This is also something we will touch ahead. Warning signs of child sexual abuse. These are very important to take note of. There are multiple signs. There are multiple signs. So basically, the signs can be divided into two major domains. One is physical signs, and then the other is behavioral signs. Physical signs: immediate slide would be bleeding, bruises, swelling of the genital area, bloody torn clothes, especially underclothes, difficulty in walking or sitting, difficulty in frequent urinary or yeast infections, pain, itching, burning in genital area. These are immediate physical symptoms that you can see if a child is being sexually abused. When we move to behavioral signs of sexual abuse, there could be changes in hygiene, in the sense that the child is suddenly not interested in being clean, keeping hygiene, maintaining hygiene that they otherwise used to, or excessively trying to, bathe and clean themselves. The next one is developing phobias. The child is scared or shows signs of phobias towards certain objects, towards certain things, or towards certain places that they would otherwise go to, which they don't go to anymore. Then there is also exhibits signs of depression or PTSD. signs of depression would be not doing the things that they otherwise would do, impairment in daily functioning. PTSD would essentially involve them bedwetting, which is also regression, but basically signs of PTSD are when you undergo a traumatic situation and when you're after the traumatic situation has passed, a lot of the impact of that situation you can see in the person. For example, nightmares, night terrors. These are very strong examples of how PTSD can affect a child who has undergone a child sexual abuse. Expressive suicidal thoughts, especially in adolescents. Adolescents, especially when they speak about it, do tend to talk about the fact that they want to end their lives because they're undergoing. So this is also a symptom that is primarily found in adolescents who have or are undergoing child sexual abuse. Has trouble in school, the child will mostly drop out of school, not go to school, refuse to go to school, be scared to go to school. There will be drops in the grades. The child will not be doing the way that they usually do at school. Inappropriate sexual knowledge or behaviors is also something that is a big indicator of a child that is probably being abused sexually. Nightmares or bedwetting is another form of PTSD, or you could say regression, where they have no control over their certain certain situations because of the trauma that they have undergone. Overly protected and concerned for siblings or assumes a caretaker role. Returns to regressive behaviors such as thumb sucking and also bedwetting. Runs away from home and school, like I said. Self-harms, children who self-harm, or even adolescents or adults who self-harm, have been going through some kind of sexual trauma since they were kids. Shrinks away or seems threatened by physical contact is also something that is an indicator that the child is scared. But one thing that we need to understand is that, no, go back to the previous. One thing we need to understand is that these are possible symptoms of child sexual abuse. Just because one or two of these symptoms are happening to the child does not mean that the child is definitely being sexually abused, but it is very important for us, if we notice something like that happening to a child, to ask the child or create a space where the child can address these issues with you so that the child can open up and speak to you about it. Which is why there is no direct correlation of these symptoms with child sexual abuse, but these are very, very jarring indicators that something really is going wrong with the child. Next one. Cultural context of child sexual abuse. First is stigma. There is no conversation about sex in families, in India especially. People don't speak about sex. There is no healthy sexual conversation about what sex is, or autonomy. So obviously there is no conversation about what can go wrong when it comes to sex, which is another reason why also children don't speak about it, because it is something that is not supposed to be talked about. Patriarchy and family honor obviously come in play here, because even if the child does end up speaking about it, it is these factors get in the way of reporting. Factors that play, so patriarchy and family honor basically are issues. So jab bacha aata hai and child speaks to the mother, for example, she will most often than not, ask the child to not say anything or do anything, and they will just not believe the child because they don't think something like this can happen to a child. Now when it specifically comes to children, there are a lot of factors that come into play here. Basically, the child does not have an awareness about what is happening to them. The child is not educated enough to understand, educated in the sense educated about them, their bodies and sex, to understand what is going on with them. The abuse is 90% of the time, as we discussed, happening from by somebody who they trust and know. The child most times does not even have words to describe what happened to them. That again points to the lack of conversation or education. Even if the child does talk about it, the adult does not trust them, which is what we spoke about. Next one. Yeah, next slide. Child sexual abuse does not just create issues for the child when they are undergoing it or as a child. Child sexual abuse has a huge impact on the development of the child. I think Ayushi is also a very good person to talk about this because they also did their thesis on child sexual abuse and its impact on interpersonal relationships, which is something that you will see that it causes long-term health and mental health issues for the individual as they grow up. It is extremely detrimental to their overall development in the sense that when you speak about understanding their sexuality, sexual health, interpersonal relationships, romantic relationships, any kind of relationships are always affected. They're also at the risk of alcohol and substance abuse as they grow up. And what makes it worse is that they get into this cycle where they are undergoing mental health issues, coupled with drug substance abuse or alcohol abuse can create comorbidities, which makes it very difficult for the individual to move out of the cycle. Next. Having suffered some episode of child sexual abuse has been linked to, this is again a repetition of what I said, poor psychological functioning, aggressive behaviors, difficulties with education, increased use of alcohol and drugs, distrusting others, which leads to a lot of interpersonal issues. And also there is a trend of when I was working on my thesis where we were talking of where I was trying to see the impact of child sexual abuse on adult sexuality and sexual health. There were a lot of trends that came into play. One that is also in a study is that there are two ways in which a victim or a survivor of child sexual abuse as an adult reacts to their in the area of their sexuality or their sexual health, wherein either they absolutely abstain from it for fear of re-traumatization, or they indulge in very risky sexual behaviors. So these are just a tip of the iceberg of what are the issues that an individual who is undergone child sexual abuse may go through as an adult. Next. So now when we speak about myths, these myths I think will overarchingly encompass the entirety of our conversation, the conversation that I've been having with you. The first myth is that child sexual abuse is not as common a problem as people claim, and that is really not true. It will be very surprising if you just sit with a group of women and men also, or anybody from any gender. If you sit with them and talk to them about childhood, everybody has at some point in their life undergone sexual harassment or sexual abuse in some capacity. So it is very common. 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 to 8 boys experience child sexual abuse in some time in their life. Second one is child sexual abuse does not happen to boys. Definitely, जैसे हमने ऊपर देखा in the previous in the table by Praja, we saw that there was a huge discrepancy in the rates of reporting of female child sexual abuse versus male. But that is majorly to do with the cultural stereotypes and the context of patriarchy, basically, because there is also a socially legal belief that men cannot be raped or that this doesn't happen to boys. So this patriarchy, masculinity, all of it together also plays a huge role when it comes to this myth being in existence. The next one is that strangers sexually abuse children. Yes, definitely, strangers can sexually abuse children, but as we discussed earlier, 90% of the time, the person who has abused the child is somebody the child knows, trusts, and is of authority in the person, child's life. Next, another one is that child sexual abuse only occurs in certain communities or socio-economic classes. People believe that child sexual abuse only happens in lower economic classes or in certain religious groups, and that is not true. Child sexual abuse occurs across all communities everywhere in the world. Child sexual abuse, another one is that child sexual abuse occurs only in dysfunctional families. Yes, it is easier for the perpetrator to gain access to the child in families that are dysfunctional, or families where the parents may not have the time or the space to uh, look after the children in a way that the child stays protected, or to notice the signs that the child is undergoing something. For example, say a single parent home, or a home that is riddled with domestic violence. We have seen in our experience also that children who come from homes where domestic violence has been prevalent definitely are more at risk of being abused sexually as children. Um Child sexual abuse perpetrators are seemingly dangerous, evil men who clearly look like child sexual abusers, and there is no such stereotype. They can look like anything and they can be anyone, like I have mentioned before, regardless of their gender, regardless of their sexual orientation. Anybody can be a sexual abuser of children. Next one. Only gay men sexually abuse boys. That is not true. Again, this is just a reiteration that anybody from any gender or sexuality can be an abuser. The next one is male survivors of sexual abuse become gay. This is a trend that has been that this is a very common narrative actually, that, and there is no scientific evidence. There are studies done on this for sure, but there is no scientific evidence that points to this conclusion as a correlation, in the sense that sexual orientation is not correlated to sexual abuse history. There may be some connection, but there is no evidence or no proof of it as of now. It is not child sexual abuse if the child has consented. Under the law, anybody below the age of 18 who is a child, irrespective of gender, cannot give consent for any sexual activity whatsoever. Even if the child, for example, if it's a 14 or a 15-year-old child who is actively involved in a relationship or a sexual relationship with someone, it is still considered as statutory rape or statutory abuse, because under the law, a child who's a minor cannot give consent. Child who's a minor, I'm sorry, a minor cannot give consent. Yes, next. It is the child's fault. This is one of the biggest issues that we face. Uh, Even people who work with adults who have lived with experiences of sexual abuse as children, this is a very common narrative. Even the child is made to believe that it is their fault that this happened to them, which is why I think majority of the people who are survivors find it very difficult to forgive themselves and move on. Entire responsibility of this abuse lies only and only on the offender or the perpetrator. Um, Adults have significant authority over a child and can very easily manipulate them and their trust. Uh, Children are not psychologically prepared to cope with repeated sexual stimulation, and this is something that we need to understand. Children don't remember what happened to them as a child, so it is fine. Oftentimes, I have heard this narrative a lot when I was doing my research in my masters about this from male survivors. I have heard them say this often, that it happened so long back and it didn't register also. So somehow I don't think it's abuse. Now I believe that it is abuse if you perceive it as abuse. But one thing that we need to understand is, just because the child has forgotten does not mean that the child may not have triggers, or that the body of the child will not remember it when they grow up. It is very important to understand that there is a psychological and a physical aspect here, and sometimes even if the person does not have memories of the sexual abuse, their body still remembers. They definitely have triggers that remind them of such issues, which can then prompt flashbacks to the child about what had happened to them. Triggers reminding them of a certain event when they were children can lead to issues. So basically, to conclude, I believe that child sexual abuse is not as linear as the general population makes it out to be. It is not this leads to this. There are multiple factors that play a role in this phenomena, for a lack of a better word. There are multiple factors like patriarchy, systemic oppression, which is rooted in so many intersections like caste, class, religion, especially in India. Therefore, it is essential to look at it from a gender, a rights, and a public health perspective, right from the family level to the larger society. These, though, again, I am aware, are broader topics that in their own capacity. This talk only covered a bird's eye view of what child sexual abuse is. It has just given you an insight into what it basically means. There are societal as well as legal factors that come into play here. The societal and legal factors that act as deterrents to this issue being to this issue being addressed are also very important evidence that we need to collect on the ground. Uh, these ground level evidences of issues pertaining to child sexual abuse as well as policy influencing advocacy is very important in this situation at the city, state, and national level. So when you look at ground level evidences on issues that are happening at the implementation level and doing advocacy at the policy level, right from the city, state to the national level, when both of these things work together is the only way in which we can penetrate this issue, because it's right from a familial to a larger society issue. So basically, both activities together is a plausible method of addressing and working to resolve this extremely chronic issue that we've been riddled with ever since the beginning of time. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aakanksha. That was a wonderful discussion. And I must say that I'm sure that this is an area that is uncomfortable even for a lot of our viewers, but it is something that has to be talked about. So I would like to thank you for opening up this discussion. And I think what I found very interesting was that you pointed out that there are a lot of complexities in something like this. It's not a very straightforward, there was a bad perpetrator and then there was child abuse. That this is related to systems, this is related to the family institution, and so many other areas that all come together to create an environment where this becomes possible. So before we address some of these areas and a lot of the comments that we're getting from the audience, I very quickly want to go to Ayushi and ask her for some initial thoughts and questions that she might have for Aakanksha.
So Aakanksha covered everything. I think she gave it a holistic perspective, and she covered it uh, in a pretty good way. Um, so like I was just noting down some points that were in the slides, so we can have a discussion about that. And one thing which you said that uh, one of the statistics which you gave, that according to the data, 109 children are sexually abused every day in India, and that is just the reported data. So this is
Yes.
something which I would like to tell our viewers, that this is just the reported data. So and reporting is not even that. Reporting this issue has a lot of problems in itself, and for the child to open up, and then somebody who knows about the law, somebody who approaches the authorities, only then the issue gets reported. So the children who get abused in India on a daily basis, and the percentage of children who go through sexual abuse in India is a lot. So this
Yes.
is a larger cultural issue for our society, which really we really need to look at it, and it's a very important issue. And I also really like the fact that you mentioned that it's a public health issue, because it is. And as we had discussed in one of our previous session as well, that how certain when we were discussing that how gender impacts well-being, uh, I would say that this issue is something that we all need to understand, even for the people who don't there is this I'm going to bring another topic over here, but won't go in depth. The topic is of feminism. So I would just like to say this one line, that feminism and feminist issues are not just gender issue and man woman issues. Feminist
Yes.
issues are related to a power equation which exists in the society. So child sexual abuse is actually a feminist issue, and in late uh, uh, around late 1900s, it was the feminists who brought up this issue, if you actually look at the history of child sexual abuse. And
Yes.
only when it became a feminist issue, we started talking about consent of children. So
Yes.
boys, girls, children of any gender are abused. And as it was also pointed out by Akanksha, that there are actually more boys who I think one of your statistics, I have lost that point, the statistics about how many girls and boys are abused. One in, I think, 4 girls and one in 6 to 8 boys, right? And
Right.
yeah, so
One.
the male, yeah, so boy, so the cases go unreported. And
Yes.
one thing which I would like to tell about the gender, not just the gender, the developmental aspect of it. Also, my dissertation was somewhere focusing on the interpersonal relationship, how children, basically how adult women survivors of child sexual abuse experience their social relationships and interpersonal relationships. Certain points came forward where their coping was dependent on the way this issue was looked at by the people who were close to them, their family or their friends. And
Right.
there were larger level problems in interpersonal relationships. People who go through abuse have a problem setting up boundaries, and for that matter, sexual boundaries. The concept of consent becomes hazy. And I think the concept of consent doesn't just start when we talk about sex, it starts from basic understanding of what consent is. Like, for example, if you, even if you're entering somebody's room, you ask them, hey, can I come in? So respecting somebody's space, and that is how we also teach our children that this is what consent is. And then we come to bodily autonomy. So somebody who have gone through this, somebody who have gone through sexual abuse faces a lot of developmental challenges psychologically and physically, and it leads to a lot of comorbidities, along with a to lifelong struggle to self autonomy in a way, and self actualization. And even if I compare it to the definition of WHO, what health is, it's physical, emotional, it's physical, mental, social, and spiritual. All these aspects are largely impacted. So I think, Akanksha, you covered it amazingly, and you covered each and every point. And the science that you covered, that these are some, like you said, that the warning signs that we need to see in children. I think all the teachers and parents needs to be aware of this. They need to be aware of certain behavioral signs which comes from children, be it physical or behavioral. And and just because we can see certain signs in children doesn't mean that the child has been sexually abused. There can be another traumatic event or just a lot of stress which can also lead to this. But the minute we see these signs, we really need to be aware. And last thing that I'd like to say right now, which after this we can have a conversation about this and can address the comments as well, that first thing, I mean, in the last thing, the first thing, that it's somebody close in the family or even somebody outside the family who the child knows and trusts, who so most of the cases, if we see and if we study the issue properly, the people who are close to the child are have the greater power to abuse the child, because the child trusts them. And to manipulate that trust and to use certain tactics as games, or certain tactics to tell the child that it is something by which they have to hide. And then it becomes this secret that the child is involved in. And then the larger family context and the patriarchy comes in, where if the child says something about this issue in the family, then the child is blamed. So this leads to a larger lifelong struggle of guilt, of not understanding sexuality properly, of not understanding consent properly, and also because there's this person who has abused the trust of the child as a kid. So that also becomes a huge problem and a huge issue. It leads to guilt, it leads to other stresses, um, and it and at a family level, like Akanksha rightly pointed out, we need to have healthy conversations around sex. We need to inform children. There's something on a larger platform which is going on as good touch, bad touch. So we need to inform children on. I think we need to have a more deeper talk with children, even when it comes to good touch and bad touch, and uh, yeah. So basically in we need an informed child, but we also need an informed society. So
Yes.
for now our first step is to inform the children, but our second step is actually to work on the societal and family level, and that should be, as communities and as a society, we really need to work towards that. And I think it should scare all of us with the amount of cases that are reported, and these are just the reported cases.
Yes.
So if these many cases are being reported and we don't even know how many cases go unreported, I think we all as a society needs to be scared, but not in a negative way. We need to be scared to fight this issue and to educate ourselves, our children, and the society on a larger level. So those are some of my thoughts on this topic.
Right. Thank you so much, Ayushi. I'm going to quickly pick one comment from the audience. And yeah, so we have Niranjan Deo saying all new parents need to be educated on this topic. Extremely important, where both parents are working and the child is left with a trusted caregiver. Just to build on this comment, because it actually brings up the role of the parents. And since we have multiple times in the course of the session until now mentioned things like bodily autonomy and children understanding touch. I would like to ask what you think of the violation of this trust, especially because something like physical abuse that is not sexual is very, very commonplace. And if it normalizes something like sexual abuse in children, so it is extremely common, extremely normal. At least I will speak for the Indian context, and I will speak for at least all the generations that I am in touch with until now. I know that it is extremely common to say, if the child is misbehaving once in a while and misbehaving a lot, it's okay to, give it one or two, to put it
Yeah.
in a very popular way. And this is a normalization of physical abuse. And do you think that there is some sort of a conduit from physical abuse to sexual abuse, where the child actually does not see it as wrong when someone in a position of authority is violating it in some way? Because the
Yeah.
former is also some sort of a violation. Yeah.
So when I was reading up on that have been written about impacts of the impact of child sexual abuse on people who undergo it, you will see there is a strong link between the fact that children who have been physically and emotionally abused as children are at a greater risk of being sexually abused as children as well, because there are actually, like you rightly said, this is a huge conversation, and the role of parents and caregivers is very important in this particular situation, because when you when it comes to autonomy of child, it is not just in the sexual domain. Raising your hand on children, oppressing children, violating their right to their own body in any capacity, puts them at these risks that we have mentioned, that happen to children who grow up as adults. Which is why there is a strong connection between physical, emotional, and sexual abuse that happens to children. So this is something that we need to be very mindful of. Parents who leave, it's very casual, at least in our cultures, to hand over the child to someone who thinks the child is cute, or children are just playing, or there's no people don't really look at what is happening. And I think it is very important, extremely important for people to understand that this will happen to children if they are not, this could happen to children if they are not supervised properly. And if the people that are entrusted to take care of these children are not, that there isn't a good background check done, or that there is no proper, as you ensure that the child is absolutely safe in the presence of this person, and also actively communicating with your child when you come back home, or when you speak to your child about their relationship with the person that they're spending so much time with, is also important. So basically, being aware of all of these factors, understanding the bodily autonomy of a child. The problem is that children are not taken seriously. People don't believe that children need to have rights, basically, because everything is done for them. And parents, since they're looking after the children, then believe that whatever we say is right only, so we will control the child, we will do whatever we want with the child. And that, I think, is wrong, because it's very and this is also one of the reasons why children are not taken seriously when they speak about their abuse, because they don't happen to them, or ऐसे कुछ हो सकता है, which is also something that is curbing their autonomy over themselves, because when they're reporting something like this has happened and you rubbish it, or if you don't believe it, or if you say that the child is making excuses or lying, it just creates all the more impact. So this is basically my attempt at explaining with everything how physical, emotional, and sexual abuse go hand in hand and affect autonomy of.
Ayushi, would
I
you
would
like
like
to
to
add
add on
something?
something here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, first thing is, I would like to quote one of my participants from my dissertation. I don't have my dissertation right now, so I can't give the exact quote. But what she was, so before that, I was just like to explain that how does this abuse works. Um, so because the perpetrator is in this trusted place of the child, when the perpetrator harms the child, or if the abuse, now this experience of that sexual act can be abused or cannot be abused, it depends on the person and how they perceive the act. So that is there. But once but when a child is abused, uh, the perpetrator would always take care of the child after the abuse. If there's a certain kind of torture involved, or certain kind, or whatever sexual act is performed, the perpetrator, because the perpetrator is in a trusted place, they usually take care of the child after the abuse. Now, what happens over here, the problem that comes with the physical abuse of children is that because it's so common in the Indian household to either beat a child, or raise hand on a child, or not listen to the child, this pattern which is there, that if somebody is hurting you and if they take care of you after that,
It means they love
this
you.
pattern makes the child confused in what is abuse and what is not abuse. So when
Yeah.
a sexual abuser or a perpetrator walks in and does and abuses the child sexually, it becomes very difficult for the child to differentiate between the abuse and the love. So somewhere the child thinks that this is love and not abuse. And that's also where, and also the rapport building that happens between the abuser and the child. So because the autonomy of the child is not respected in the cultural context of India, I would not talk about globally as of now, but in the cultural context of India, the autonomy of the child is not that respected, and somewhere we do not see children as individuals who have boundaries, who have consent, who need a bodily autonomy, because adults have that kind of power over children where they can easily walk into their boundaries. That somewhere where children, it becomes difficult for children to actually differentiate between the act of abuse and between the act of care. And with this, I would also like to bring in an example that I saw in one of the tribal villages in Odisha, and it really made me happy actually, because I went to this small hamlet, and in one of the houses, a woman was sitting with her child, a baby, and I just went to her and I asked her if I can, if I can just touch the baby or maybe play with the baby. And the baby just turned around and didn't want me around him. So this woman just tells me that this he doesn't want to come, so I'm not gonna give you the baby. So somewhere I got really happy that she respected even her baby's autonomy over this stranger. I wasn't a stranger there because I had built that rapport with the community, but being somebody who had been spending time with her and being a female bodied individual, she still did not hand me her baby over because she respected her baby's autonomy. And I think we need to respect children even. So basically that respect of autonomy and consent and not confusing love with violence is something that parents really need to take care of, because this will really confuse the child if the perpetrator walks in. Those are my thoughts on that.
Right. Thank you, Ayushi. Before moving on to the next comment and question, I would just like to add that I think Niranjan is right when they say that there should be some sort of awareness that is created for new parents. Just as we have sex education and we need better sex education, there should be some sort of prevention of abuse education. I don't know how much of it is actually reaching our target, which is everybody, ideally. But of course, there is some amount of education that does exist, but something that is compulsory given to parents the moment there is a birth or something like this, perhaps would be a good idea. Could we move to Cheryl Fernandez's comment? And there is also a question within it. I'm just going to very quickly read it out. POCSO has strong provisions on paper, but its implementation still desires a lot more to be done. Even after 8 years of its implementation, it remains a relatively unknown act, which unfortunately means a lot of cases of CSA are not reported. So my question is, what can be done or is being done to, first of all, increase acceptance in society that child sexual abuse is an important problem we face, and secondly, since most perpetrators are family members, how to increase confidence to report such cases?
Okay. So, child sex. So that's POCSO basically is an act that is written, which is actually a very beautifully written act, and it is also an act that is very easy to understand. So a lay person who probably does not have any background on in law or doesn't know how understand legal language does not have, it's not a problem because POCSO is very well written and easy. The problem is POCSO also, in our next session we will speak about it. POCSO is written from the point of view of the child, with only and only keeping the child in the picture, only to look at the convenience and the protection of the child. uh, yes, but it is very difficult to implement it because our, I think our systems are not in place for that kind of an advanced child rights perspective, is what I feel. There are multiple barriers to reporting of POCSO, right from it doesn't get out of the family to if it goes to the family, police mein problem hota hai, and all of that. So yes, I agree when they say that POCSO, it's very difficult. Underreporting is a huge problem. Can you please flash the question? Uh, to increase acceptance in society that child sexual abuse is an important problem, I think if we have to target all sections of society, right from all the stakeholders in a child's life. For example, right from the time the child goes to school, right from the time the child is born, actually at home, to school, to any tuitions or any play, any association that the child is in contact with, any person or any stakeholder in the child's life needs to know about this, because that is the only way I think we can address, identify, and address these issues adequately. um, from also, so this is something that we've been doing. So we are also some a really interesting thing in child protection that we're currently looking at in certain in child protection, basically advocacy, is trying to set up, there are a lot of, actually a lot of government regulations that ensure that basically ask for provision of bodies at different levels, at say the city level, at the state level, at national levels, that look into these issues. That is also something that needs to be worked on, because government regulation hai, but wo body exist nahi karta. So a lot of NGOs and child protection advocacy people have taken up these government regulations to implement it, to ensure that community level pay, city level, ward level pay, there is some intervention, there is some action done in order to increase awareness, to address issues that are happening at the field level as well. Perpetrators are family members, and how to increase confidence to report such cases. Again, I think work has to happen from all sides. Family systems have to be strengthened, educated. A lot of the policies of the government also play a huge role in this. Schools need to, include these awareness programs in their curriculums. These are a few things that I can think of the top of my head as to how. So, but basically, the point of the matter is all of it, I feel, has to happen together in the same, I don't know, capacity for things to start functioning. Because you can't, it's not a bottom up or a top down approach. दोनों तरफ से हो तो ही, I think it's possible to, in some way, ensure that cases are reported and actual work is done.
Thank you. Thank you. Ayushi, would you like to add something, or shall we proceed to the next question?
I think Aakanksha covered everything, involving the stakeholders, having a wraparound approach that is basically involving all the stakeholders, and it's not a bottoms up or top down approach. It needs to go together. So she covered everything in that.
Right. So Cheryl actually has another question. So let's flash that as well. Cheryl says another issue, if the speakers could comment on it, of course. Death penalty has been added to POCSO Act in 2019. In the long run, is it a boon or bane? Will it mean more problems for children, as perpetrators might try to eliminate the best witness of the crime, the child, in order to get away with it? Not that they're not getting away with it now, but will it worsen?
Should I speak, Ayushi, or do you want to speak?
I think it's a larger level issue of capital punishment as well, and it needs to be looked at from a lot of lens. I think that anyway the rate of reported cases is so less, and so basically it needs to be looked at from a lot of lens. Firstly, we need to, it requires a whole other debate of capital punishment, if it's if capital punishment actually, in my opinion, on secondly, as capital punishment has been added to the act, I really can't comment on the behavior of the perpetrator over here, because usually in my experience, that when I have dealt with survivors, it's a long term, it's basically this it happens through for a long time, either so a perpetrator engages with
Ayushi, I think we're having some trouble hearing you. Perhaps you could come back to us in a moment. Perhaps you could come back to us in a moment. Aakanksha, would you like to fill in until Ayushi fixes her audio?
Yeah, so I think there are two things that I want to say. One, we have to understand that our law is reformative. When we speak of capital punishment or the death penalty, I personally do not agree with it. I also feel that yes, it is the issue that Sharon listed about, how there is a greater chance of the perpetrator being more violent or killing the person who they have abused. Yes, definitely, that is a concern. And also, the second thing I think we need to understand is we need to look at what we think justice is. So there is a recent trend in child protection where what we're looking at is for the longest time, child protection advocates would work to ensure that the perpetrator is behind bars and gets the punishment that they deserve, which I think is a very important thing to do. But considering the circumstances and the issues that we face when it comes to implementing the POCSO Act, a lot of focus now for justice is given to the adequate rehabilitation of the person who has undergone that abuse. So I think that is something we need to look at more than debating on whether or not the clauses in the act have issues, because they definitely do. There are, every single law has certain measures that they take that act as deterrents, but sometimes may not act as deterrents. And we all know, to a great extent, we've seen that capital punishment usually does not deter a person from committing that crime, especially a crime like child sexual abuse, from which you can get off very easily as a perpetrator, if it not reported. So I think, yes, so I think we need to look at what we think justice is, because according to me, I personally believe that uh, when a child undergoes sexual abuse, uh, the first thing that the child requires is to ensure that they start to work or get the access to help that they deserve, to ensure that they grow up in a way that the impact of the abuse is neutralized or is worked on, so that they can look at it in a healthy way and eventually learn to cope with it. Because I think that is the thing that we need to focus on more than uh, for me personally, more than issues like these.
Right, right. And also, I think just pragmatically, the capital punishment very often is something that disprivileges lower socioeconomic strata generally.
Definitely.
You very often do not find people in positions of power and privilege hanging for their crimes. Another entire different topic is whether people should hang at all, and whether rehabilitation. But even within that, it is
Yeah.
something that disprivileges lower socioeconomic classes. And especially when it comes to child abuse, we have consistently seen multiple cases of child abuse rackets that are very, very high up in on the socio-economic level in society. You have multiple cases that are coming up even internationally, and you very clearly do not see these rich men hanging for their crimes, rich people hanging for their crimes. Ayushi, we have Ayushi back. Would you like to chip in?
Can you hear me now? Is my voice clear?
Yes, yes, it is. Yes.
Okay. I think you both of you covered it properly. That firstly, capital punishment is a completely different subject that we need to look at. We need to look at our concept of justice, and like Hridaya rightly pointed out, that it's not the rich people who are hanged for their crimes. It's mostly people belonging to the lower socioeconomic background. And even if we look at our justice system, the people who are behind the bars are not mostly, they are not the rich people. If we look at the majority, either they are people from lower class or lower caste. So it becomes a completely different debate. But I mean, for now, even when the death penalty wasn't added, POCSO was one of the most stringent and the most strict laws which ever came. And even then, it did not prevent people from committing the crime, because we need to work at a societal level. So that's all I would like to add in this question.
Thank you, Ayushi. Let's take a question from Saloni Anand. Saloni Anand says, are there differences in how risk and protective factors play out across diverse cultural groups? Aakanksha, would you like to take this?
Yeah. Yes, there are differences in how risk and protective factors play out across diverse cultural groups. The person's religion, the person's socioeconomic strata, the person's where they come from, the value systems in the family, the laws in the place where they work, where they live. All of these things impact the predictive factors and the risk factors. In fact, you will see that in tribal communities, like Ayushi rightly pointed out, children are given more autonomy and more right in certain tribes, and you see a more open, discourse or practice about sexual or any such topics that we usually don't see in the country otherwise. So yes, definitely there are a lot of differences in how it works. And like I said in the last slide as well, that there are too many intersections in general, especially in a country like India, that come into play in any circumstance, not just child sexual abuse. So child sexual abuse is not exempt from it. So yeah, that's how I'd like to answer it. Ayushi, you want to say something?
Yes, so there is a cultural context to the risk and the protective factors, and it also somewhere the way basically Akanksha had pointed out in one of her slides also that one of the myth is that CSA happens in families which are dysfunctional. So somewhere it does add on to the risk factor, but it's not necessary that only the children in dysfunctional families are exposed to abuse. But when we look at various intersections and various cultures in the society, also when we look at children who are in need of care and protection, uh, children on the streets, children who who are basically children on the streets, on railway stations, children in homes, children who are in institutions, they somewhere they are more exposed to these risk factors because somewhere that protection is not there. But again, I would like to say that the way our family systems also function, it it sometimes that adds on to the risk factor. So it's a very so culture does play a role. And when I say that culture does play a role, even when I look globally, the definition of child changes. Person who has autonomy at a, what is the age of consent, what is the age when engaging in any sexual activity is okay. So globally also the age of child changes, so culture does add to the risk and protective factors. uh, so yeah, it becomes this it becomes this huge intersection and mix of factors which can lead to abuse of children, but then it happens across all the stratas and cultural contexts in the Indian society. That's there. That's it.
Thank you. I think Saloni's mention of culture and the idea of risk and protection got me thinking. There we do have one entire part to, or one entire aspect to CSA, that is actually sharing content that is pornographic and involves children, of course. And this is something that is banned, and there have been multiple organizations that are devoted to taking such videos down. And of course, the boundaries there are very clear. However, I would like to ask your opinion about sharing images of children on social media, because we keep talking about how um, a lot of laws say that consent is not possible under the age of 18. So what about child privacy in an area like this, especially because there is a very clear sexualization of children? I mean, I have read a couple of studies when I was reading up on violence against specifically women. And I remember reading about a couple of studies that suggested that a lot of women actually faced violence when they were between the ages of, I think, 11 and 21 than after. And this got me thinking that there was perhaps something to do with that vulnerability. And I'm just trying to connect the two. So what do you think of maybe something like that sexualization of children? And see, this was slotted under violence against women and not specifically child sexual abuse. So there is this sense of looking at levels of maturity online, sexualizing them, especially young female or male celebrities and actors who have a big presence there. What do you think about this? Do you think parts of it count as abuse? Should there be laws about it, and or should there be free production and consumption?
So I feel so even in this in the social sector, when we work with children very closely, not necessarily in a therapeutic way, right? So when we work with children, oftentimes our donors also sometimes ask us for pictures of the activities that we've taken, or so that is something that is more relevant to my area of work. So that is something I'll be able to answer well. Uh, when we so there is this larger debate that is also going on, that do we really need to take pictures of children and post them online, even if it is for whatever reason? And a lot of advocates of child protection believe that it should not happen, and if it does happen, then identifiers of the child should not be visible in the pictures. um, and there needs to be some kind of code of conduct. And so a lot of institutions, NGOs, organizations, schools that do engage in photography of children, or that require this to happen, should have strict child protection policies in place within their organizations that have a code of conduct for this. They need to have a strict, these are the guidelines that we will follow when it comes to protecting the anonymity or the identity of the child who we are working with in any capacity. So that is something that is happening. So yes, definitely putting pictures of children on social media, or especially without consent of the child and or of the parent, is absolutely a no, and it should definitely not happen, because we never know how it is going to be utilized, because once it's on the web, you don't have any control over it. Yes, there are multiple organizations and groups working towards this very issue, and as you rightly said, it is a whole ball game in itself. Again, all of these types of sexual abuse that we've listed, honestly, are topics that we can have in-depth conversations on for like hours, because they all in themselves have so many layers of issues and areas that need to be addressed and spoken about. So yeah.
Ayushi, would you like to add?
Yeah, so again, Akanksha covered the part of the question that how basically the code of conduct and having a child protection policy inside these organizations. But you pointed out this one thing that in a research that you read, that women in the age group of 11 to 22 are more reported that abuse was more in that age group than after that. Just to add on to that, like I pointed out, that this is a feminist issue, so this is a power issue. So in my perspective, if we are looking at that age group, that age group increases the vulnerability, because it's easy to oppress women in that particular age group. Because if you look at boys, I think after a certain age group, that like feminine quality are more submissive. So children are in a way more, this is there's this book which talks about that there's children somewhere have more of those feminine quality, in terms of that submissive quality which can be oppressed, and that gratification out of power. The perpetrator can feel gratification out of that power of abusing. So women and girls in the age group of 11 to 22 are definitely more vulnerable because of this power equation which comes in. So that's the only thing I would like to point out from that conversation.
Right. Thank you. Sure, Akanksha.
One thing that I want to, this is something that Ayushi spoke about even before, just after I was done speaking. One of the myths that I think I have missed out is a very important myth, that child sexual abuse, or in fact any sexual abuse for that matter, happening to anybody, is more an act of power than it is of sexual gratification. And that is something that we need to really understand. Because, for example, even if you look at, say, if there is a riot in an area between two communities, for example, the first thing, the first population to be attacked will be children and women, right? They are the first. Children and women will be raped, children and women will be, tortured, abducted, because of the reasons that Ayushi just said. I just wanted to add to that.
Right. Thank you. Also, we have a question from Neha here, but just before we get to Neha's question, I just have to add a very quick and small point, because we talked about cultural context. I think virginity and ideas of virginity and purity do also play a role in some of, let's say, the driving cultural forces that actually maybe perhaps sexualize children, and also lead to a very, very potent and unfortunate trafficking network all over the world. We have all heard myths like virgins in some cultures are thought to cure certain kinds of diseases, virgins are supposed to be more sexually gratifying, etc., etc. We know that the concept of virginity itself is a construct, but it is still a very, very powerful construct, and is, I think, something that plays a role in the abuse of children, because it is something that is seen as a given with young children. So that is another very virginity, and the concept of virginity, of course, has caused multiple problems, but especially in this sense as well, it's quite potent. So let's please come to the next question. We had Neha's question on display here. Yeah. Neha says, what do you think is the current scenario of the immigrant children? How are they monetized? It's a very interesting question.
It is a very interesting question, and I think I am not the best person to answer this because I don't have enough information on it. But I think Ayushi would be a good person to answer this question. She.
I think Ayushi may have lost connectivity. Perhaps we can come back to Neha's question later. Let's take a question from Shruti. Shruti Narayan says, how do you approach the topic of good touch and bad touch when talking about something as basic as things related to changes that happen during puberty are ostracized?
Okay, so firstly, I think I don't necessarily agree with the terms good touch and bad touch. I think the terms I prefer are safe and unsafe touch. I'm sorry, I think there is a connection. So can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. It's fine. You can continue talking. I think your screen has frozen, but you can continue talking. We can hear you.
Okay. How do you approach the topic of good touch, bad touch when talking about something as basic as literature? This again, I believe, honestly, is something that needs to start from a home level, should trickle into the school levels. I also believe that schools have a huge role to play when it comes to right from nursery, I believe, till whatever standard. I think it's very important for schools uh, to have certain policies or certain curriculum in place where they do talk about these things, and they educate children right from the beginning about the changes in their body, normalize the talking about what gender is, what our body is, what sex is. The problem is that all of these things are such taboo topics that people don't tend to want to address them, which leads to so many issues, because there is this weird mystery attached to it, and then that just leads to a lot of issues in people. Good touch, bad touch in the context of puberty, I think they're two completely directly related topics that we've spoken about at a school level, at a family level, and like I said, organizations that are working in communities, like for example with the urban poor, need to train stakeholders that work with children, for example Anganwadi centers, who work directly with children, to then be able to speak about these things and train children. Similar.
Thank you, Aakanksha. Ayushi, we had a question for you. If we can go back to Neha's question. What do you think is the current scenario of the immigrant children, and how are they monitored?
what sorry what do you think is the current scenario?
I'll just reread it. What do you
I'm
think
not
is the
able to
current scenario?
understand the context of the question over here. So, Neha, can you just give a little bit of context to the question? I'm not able to really understand what is the exact question over here.
Perhaps Neha can come back to us with a question. I think Neha has also posted another question. Perhaps Ayushi, that is clearer. Yeah. What about the parents who themselves sell their kids either to marry them off or force them into prostitution? In cases like these, who does the child turn? I think this, if I may just add before you answer the question, this does fall in line with what Empower People does. Their cause is bride traffic, to empower bride traffic and survivors. So this is something that is very often what they address. Yeah, Ayushi. Ayushi, perhaps you are on mute. Could you unmute yourself?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, we can.
Is the voice clear? Because I'm sorry, I'm
Yeah.
having some internet because of the rain.
That's all of us in Mumbai today.
Yeah. So, right. So first thing is that, okay, so we are talking about parents who sell their kids, or even if we talk about traffickers. Uh, See, first structural issue that we to understand here is the lopsided development that had happened all over India. The level of poverty which is over there, and we basically need to understand all the structural issues, which is another completely different topic. It is not a completely different topic, but it's a topic which needs to be covered in depth. But for this question, there are in cases like these, who does the child turn to? Like Rita rightly pointed out, that Empower People is working for children, like children who are trafficked and people who are trafficked. So there are organizations working for that. There are legal authorities in place for this. There are legal committees which are in place for this. There are laws which are in place for this. But in my perspective, something which also needs to be addressed is the societal awareness around these issues, and the stigmatization which comes along with somebody who has been trafficked, or somebody who has been rehabilitated, who have also, if some organization also intervenes, and if there have been somebody who have been rescued, then the kind of stigmatization which revolves around victims or survivors of trafficking, that is something we really need to discuss as a society, and that is some work that needs to happen, because sex is such a taboo topic, and virginity is such a taboo topic in the cultural context of India, and how a woman's and a female bodied individual's honor, basically their honor and their respect, is uh, attached to their sexuality, that also impacts how somebody who has been trafficked treated. So one of the first thing is, we really need to work on education and livelihood and the complete development of different communities in different places in different geographical contexts in India, which is one of the main determinant to trafficking. Secondly, we need proper laws in place for people, for basically for traffickers. And one thing I would like to point out for parents also who are viewing this, that internet has become one of the largest places, so not the largest, internet has become a very huge medium for the traffickers to connect with children. So I wouldn't say that monitor your children, but make your children aware of the strangers on internet. And you can always contact organizations and social workers around your area to discuss that how can you, or even mental health professionals for that matter, on how to basically make your child aware around these issues. So internet has been becoming a major platform for human traffickers. So firstly is the development side, secondly being aware about these issues, and having systems in place. Thirdly, if a child or a woman is trafficked, then there are organizations in place, there are laws in place, and as citizens and responsible citizens of this country, I think it becomes all our responsibility to report if we see certain cases, or if we see that something on these lines is happening around us. And so this is uh, uh, quickly I will just cover another point in this. As I started my degree in masters in social work, one of my field work was actually working on railway stations with a non-profit, where I had to be an outreach social worker to rescue children from the platforms. So people who are in Mumbai, I would not be able to talk about other states. You can actually, if there is an unaccompanied minor, if there is somebody who is a little suspicious, who is with minors, you can always take an action for that, or go to the railway police in that matter. So that's just one point that I'd like to add. Rest, if Akanksha would like to add anything to this conversation, that would be great.
This question in itself, like Ayushi said, lost connection in the middle, so I must have missed out on something, so I may repeat. But why parents do it is also something that we need to understand. Firstly, secondly, there was a talk I attended about commercial sexual exploitation in general, not just of children, in which they spoke about the trends that they have seen. When we speak of, we have to understand why this also happens. There was a person from Madhya Pradesh who works in an organization that works for this issue. Against this issue. They basically said that in the tribal belts of MP, you will see that there is more of this happening where parents are selling their children, all that. But that is because that is a very deprived area. Also, I think also in Aishi's experience, since she's worked closely with children in need of care and protection, uh, you will see that these are the children who come from extreme deprivation. Uh, and areas, they could also be refugee children. Actually, they're usually from areas that where they've escaped, or from where they've been bought or sold. That will primarily, I don't think any parent honestly wants to sell their child. It's just that level of deprivation and poverty that leads to this happening. Of course, there is a huge patriarchal point of view to it, but I just wanted to highlight that there is a reason why these things happen. And for us to completely understand those reasons, we have to look at so many aspects that come under commercial sexual exploitation of children.
Right. I wanted to ask you something that has been, before we go to the next audience question. I want to ask you something that has been really niggling at me ever since we've begun our talk, and that is a lot of the questions that we have, or the lot of the points that we have made, all talk about what is to be done after the abuse is already there. I mean, just as we have rehabilitation centers, is there something that actually can be done for prevention? Because it, of course, it's quite an abuser is, I would say, not born in a day. There is some sort of, I think, a journey from a thought to maybe the consumption of something to the act of actually abusing a child. And is there some sort of preventive measure already, or should there be some preventive measure that kind of interrupts that process of someone who turns into a child abuser? Because I think it's very often when we talk about things like rape, and when we talk about things like child abuse especially, there is this tendency to make the abuser seem like a monster from another species, but that is usually not how it works. What you have repeated over and over again is that the abuser is often from the know, from within the family or the group close to the child. So these are people who are around us and like us. So how what are your insights on preventing child sexual abuse in the first place? Akanksha? Ayushi? Yeah.
So I was saying that so I worked so in the first year of my masters, I was placed with an organization that worked with children in conflict with law. So I was working very closely with children who committed heinous offenses like rape and murder. And before I went into this setup, I had very clear ideas about what I thought was right and wrong when it came to rape, because that is all sexual abuse, because that is something we all have, right? Because that's bad. It should not happen. And anybody who does it is a terrible human being. After I went there, I'll just give you a small example or an experience which will pretty much sum up what you just started. So when I got my first case of rape that was committed by a 14-year-old boy on a 10-year-old or a 6 to 7, a very small boy, another boy, no girl. So basically, it happened, and I told my supervisor that I will not be able to work with this person because I don't agree with the person at all. I hate this person. So what my supervisor did is my supervisor sent me to the child's house for a home visit and asked me to do this thing called social investigation report, which basically you then submit to the juvenile justice board where the case is going on, so that they understand the social context of the child who's committed the rape. When I went there, uh, it was obviously in a slum, uh, because those are the cases that are majorly taken to the police station. Like we said, the rich people usually don't get arrested for their crimes. So this slum, it was a small, tiny room where there was a man who was the head of the family, the father of the boy, drunk out of his mind. I don't know, drunk high out of his mind in one corner of the room. And there was this woman who was heavily pregnant, and there were, I am not kidding you, there were 6 children in the house. And after speaking to them for a really long time, basically the synopsis of it was that the father used to abuse the mother sexually in front of the children. The father used to sexually abuse the children. The father had multiple cases of theft, murder, etc. on him. 2 children who were adults are now in Arthur Road jail. So that was the situation of the child. The child himself had undergone sexual abuse. So where can you say how, so at what point can you say what is bad and what is good, and how that anyone who commits any crime is a bad person and an evil? There is always a context to why somebody does what they do, and this is something that I struggle with often, because when it comes to empathy, it's difficult to give empathy to some people, right? Because you don't necessarily agree with their actions, but it is a fact that perpetrators become the way they do for whatever reasons, and it doesn't have to be a sad backstory like this was. It could be anything, but patriarchy, in I think that in itself plays such a huge role in how men, or how perpetrators, not just men, look at children, look at vulnerable populations. All of this together plays a huge role in somebody doing something like this as a perpetrator. So yes, the big bad person, yes, definitely it is very easy to hate on them, and it is very natural. But I also at the same time feel that um, everybody has rights, including the person who commits the crime. But there are people and organizations that work with them, and then there are people and organizations that work with the survivors. And everybody has their own agenda and their own motive of doing what they do to ensure a better society. So I think both things have to go hand in hand in order for everything to function properly.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Ayushi, there's, I think, a question that continues from Neha that perhaps you could address. So Neha says there was a case where a minor girl was kidnapped and a case where the child was abandoned altogether by an immigrant couple. So my question is, has there been an increase in CSA post-lockdown?
I think firstly, this question is two questions. Secondly, I would one thing that I would like to address, not from the person who's asking this question, but when even Aakanksha was talking about the family and how, and there was another question, I think that was also from Neha, that how some parents traffic their child and questions like these. I would really like our viewers to think and reflect about that. uh, and also the question that Hridaya said, Hridaya asked that these are people who are around us. They are not like the big bad people. These are people who are around us, who are like us. So, firstly, we need to blame people, but we also need to understand the context. So, when we are saying an immigrant couple abandoned their child, are we talking about that immigrants are bad because the question somewhere is pointing out or is somewhere underlying that thing? Also, when the other question was asked that certain parents sell their children, and somewhere that points out that these people are mostly poor people. So, are we implicitly trying to say that at certain places there are certain people who are to be blamed? So this is one question that I would like to ask our viewers. If anybody have some points or some questions around these, please add that to the comments. Secondly, when we look at the an immigrant couple who abandoned their child, we do not know the context. I'm not saying that we need to empathize completely with people who have abandoned their child, but we need to understand the structural determinants and and at that time the contextual determinants which would have come into place for this couple to abandon their child. So that would be there. Now, was this child completely abandoned or kidnapped? I don't know the story, so I really cannot comment about that. But if we talk about if there has been rising cases of CSA post lockdown, yes, the statistics have come in where there have been rising cases of CSA, that is child sexual abuse. I think Childline also published a study where there was an increase in child sexual abuse as well as domestic violence. So there are studies like that. Um, there are also this is not from a study, but I was just talking, not I was basically after the lockdown I was talking to somebody in Delhi who works in child protection, and they told me that there have been a rise in cases. And in Delhi I think there is also one app called Meri Awaaz where people can if there's abuse inside the family, or basically there is child sexual abuse, child or any one of the stakeholder can directly go on the app and anonymously report the case. So somewhere I heard, I when I interacted with them, they told me that there have been rising cases through that application also. So there have been rising cases, but we also need to question, is this rise in cases because the level of abuse increased after post lockdown? Were these cases uh, this much only before the lockdown? Was has the reported increase after the lockdown? So these are some questions which we need to ask ourselves. We need some more research on this, and we need to think about this more. And I think Akanksha would be the best person to comment about if there is an increase in post lockdown CSA cases, because she has more idea about that.
Yeah, Akanksha?
Yes, there definitely has been an increase in, not increase in thing, but if you speak to organizations that have helplines running, a lot of domestic violence in general, and I do think that child sexual abuse does come under the overarching theme of domestic violence if it happens within the home, uh, and that has increased definitely to a great extent. I do not have the statistics, but I did attend a talk in just post lockdown, a little while after lockdown, where there were organizations that ran helplines across India. And they spoke about the emerging trend where there is a large number of any aspect of domestic violence, sexual exploitation of women and children that is happening since everybody is at home now. Especially in slum communities and with the urban poor, because they live in such close quarters, and they do have, I'm not generalizing this, but there is a lot of violence within households in communities. um, women and children are more at risk of that violence, because now the person who is abusing them is at home all the time, frustrated. There's no job, there's no money, there's no food. uh, there is rampant substance abuse, alcohol abuse. So all of these things, to a great extent, add to the situation and make it worse. बट लाइक आयुषी सेड, इट इज इम्पोर्टेंट टू थिंक अबाउट कितने केसेस हो चुके हैं, क्या ये केसेस ज्यादा रिपोर्ट अब इसलिए हो रहे हैं बिकॉज वी हैव because lockdown is there and these things are being highlighted. There are many factors to it. Also, the number of cases that are being reported, I am reiterating again and again, is not enough. Um and I'm sorry, I just wanted to bring this out before only, that another huge aspect of child sexual abuse is also child marriage, uh, which is also listed under POXO. So a lot of the cases that are reported under POXO are majority child marriage cases. So a lot of the cases that happen within homes are still not being reported the way they should be reported. So these are all factors that I think we need to consider when it comes to answering this question.
Right. Thank you, Aakanksha. I think we're going to take the last question from the audience for the day. So we have a question from Tanvi Deshpande. She says, genital mutilation is considered a serious form of CSA. Can you shed some light on how this crime is handled? And is it something that does get reported often? I think before I give it over to our speakers, I think we also should acknowledge that genital mutilation and the conversation in India is religiously grounded very often. Yeah. So, in that context, perhaps Ayushi, Akanksha, who would like to take it up first?
Anybody, Ash, you want to speak? You can speak it.
Yeah, okay. So, yes, the conversation around genital mutilation is religiously and culturally grounded. Uh, how is this crime handled? Honestly, I have not really. So I have just read about the issue. I have really not interacted with anybody who have either experienced this in their family or somebody they know of, or have met somebody in the legal or the police authority who have handled this issue. So I have not directly uh, I don't know directly about this issue, but this is one major issue which has been come forward in India, and there are some specific communities where this is practiced. Um, Another thing is that it's again we need to look at it from the gender lens, that how uh, co- basically how controlling a woman's sexuality is a major thing which comes through the patriarchal point of view, which is prevalent in our society and prevalent and prevalent in some culture and some context. So we do need more details about this. Details as a even the researches I have read, I haven't read a very detailed research with respect to communities, and only one community has come up. I am not really going into the religious groundings of this because I don't want to just point it out that hey, this community does it, because I don't think we have enough research about this. Akanksha, would you like to add anything to that?
One thing that we need to know is that the Ministry of Women and Child Development in December, I think somewhere in 2017, said that we don't have enough evidence that this exists in India. So this is, yeah. So this is something that we need to look at. This it's clearly not true because it does exist. Also, I think all of us need to know more about what female genital mutilation entails, because we have very set ideas about what happens within certain communities, because that is the information that we have received. But I am pretty sure there are many ways in which this takes place. But like Ayushi said, yes, it is majorly to do with controlling a female bodied individual's sexuality, because or controlling sexuality in multiple ways. There is one that so when you remove the clitoris, basically what you're trying to say is that that does not provide any biological function for childbirth. So you don't need that, because it's just a pleasure, and then that will just, it's called some evil something, because it makes women go the wrong path. That is also a way of controlling sexuality. Then there is also the whole narrative around we need to keep our daughters safe, is also something that is the narrative around female genital mutilation or any kind of control over women's sexuality, because that way they can ensure that nothing bad happens to the child. So there are so many aspects which, again, like I said, majorly all point down to how patriarchy has completely trickled down into all aspects of our lives when it comes to. But yes, like I'm not very well versed with every other female genital mutilation. I am pretty sure there are at least groups working on this, if not organizations. But this is very interesting. I will read up on it.
Right. I also think that we have to also take into consideration that when we talk about genital mutilation, not just female genital mutilation, there are multiple conversations. I think the conversation changes considerably about genital mutilation when you move outside of the Indian subcontinent. Then it becomes about circumcision, yes or no, and what circumcision entails. And I think we have to look also, of course, there is the policing of female pleasure and sexuality, but also look at this in the larger frame of reference of cultural and religion, or culturally and religiously marking young bodies that cannot consent. I think, of course, there is a difference in the degree and in the effects that these acts have. But just to give you an example, piercing a child's ears is commonplace in many, many, many cultures. And you do believe that the child wants you to pierce their ears. I mean, we also pierce male-bodied individuals' ears when they're 2 or 3 years old. And I'm not trying to say that this amounts to the same thing as genital mutilation, but I'm saying that there is this sort of cultural or religious sanction to allowing inflicting this, to allowing this pain to be inflicted on the child's body.
I just have one thing to add to what you just said.
Yeah, sure. Please go ahead.
It's a rite of passage, right? All of these things that we just spoke about are rites of passage. Whether it is,
absolutely,
I'm not saying circumcision is genital mutilation. It is a debate. So
right.
all of these things that people point out as genital mutilation or any kind of autonomy where we do something to a child without the child really consenting is often rite of passage. That is how you go ahead in life. It's part of your culture. It is imbibed, so it's normalized.
Right. Absolutely.
So it stops being a problem, basically.
Absolutely. And I think we also have to take into consideration that when we talk about these things, even as we are discussing them right now, we are taking into consideration hegemonically present cultures that have the power to express themselves in popular media. There are so many cultures that, unfortunately, none of us have even been exposed to or read about, even in the depths of our study about anything related to gender. And I think we have to, when we have this discussion, I think this is something that really comes up almost every time we talk about something like this, is that we have to take into consideration the fact that one size does not fit all. This is exactly what we said even last time when we were discussing a lot of these aspects with our Ayushi, that there has to be cultural sensitivity, and that even the concept of child changes with cultures. I mean, we know that it was not always the arbitrary age of 18, and that for some cultures it is all these ideas change. And there were points where an 11-year-old child, as we know now, who had begun menstruating was considered a woman. So we have to, and of course, that there are pockets of culture around the world. Why around the world? In the Indian subcontinent, that do also have these ideas. So when we talk about things like child sexual abuse and perhaps things like genital mutilation or other things that are rites of passage and so on, that we have to take these cultural differences into consideration. Because if we try to, I think, impose uh, um, a policy or a law that is made at a level that is so far removed from these cultures, then there will be some sort of friction, and maybe the effectiveness, we keep talking about how the effectiveness is always something that is a bit of a problem. Perhaps the effectiveness will increase if there is a more holistic formation of these laws.
I just
I would,
wanted
I would
to,
like, sure, sorry? Yeah,
I
please go
just
ahead,
like
Akanksha.
one point to what you
Sure,
said.
sure.
When you speak of the holistic aspect to law, I think that can happen when there is representation and active of the persons that the law is being made for. And that is a very very important thing that we need to take, that people who are advocating policy change or influence policy work on that. It's very important for us to understand this aspect. Is all I wanted to say, that there needs to be representation, because somebody sitting in the parliament may not know issues that a child faces. Somebody facing the parliament does not know trans rights, because they're not trans, they're probably not trans, so they don't, so there is no representation unless and until you take into consideration lived experiences of people you're making those policies or laws for. I don't think the policies or laws will ever be effective. Secondly, definitely there is no one size fits all for policies, but when a policy is made at a national level, it is very important for that very policy to trickle down in a contextualized way at the state and the ward level, because the states and the ward level know the context, right? So when you make a one size fit all policy, also at the smaller levels it needs to be contextualized, and that's all.
Um, I will invite Akanksha and Ayushi to make their final observations. But just before that, I would say that they have been so kind to put together a list of helplines that we announced at the beginning of this session. This list will be flashed as we speak, and you can find it in the bio of our YouTube video. And we will also try to post it on Facebook. So please, if you feel the need to do so, do seek help. And with that, Ayushi, would you like to express some final thoughts about this session? Oh, by the way, this is not the end of the session. This is only the end of the first part of the session. We have another follow-up session on social legal aspects coming up next Friday. So please join us for that as well. But for this session, Ayushi, your final thoughts?
Yeah. So thank you again for having me. It's been great here. So I would just like to conclude that we as a society need to be more aware about this issue. We need to really think that this is not something that is happening to others. This is not something that the strangers are doing. This can happen inside families, and we really need to protect our children, and we really need to have a conversation with them. We need to we need to also focus on the patriarchal aspects which come in, and we also need to look at it as a power issue. And I'm really thinking that out because this is something that had happened in one of the trainings that I was taking in Orissa. Somebody had come and talked to the children, and while talking about good touch and bad touch, which Akanksha also pointed out, and something which I also believe in, that we need to talk about safe and unsafe touch rather than good touch and bad touch. I prefer those terms better. But somebody who had come to talk about good touch and bad touch had told children that there is a boundary that you have around you, which is a physical boundary, where only your husband or your mother can enter and nobody else. So somewhere when we talk about consent with children, we really need to think about what we are talking, because if I'm telling young girls that only your husband can enter this boundary, then when they grow up to and again we are talking in gender binaries over here, But when they grow up and they get married, again the concept of consent really gets damaged over there. So while talking about these issues, while talking about sex, while talking about sexuality, while talking about all of these issues which are tabooed in our society, it is going to be an uncomfortable conversation for parents also, but we really need to have it, and we all need to work together with it. We also you will get a list of helplines after this, and like I said, let's just be responsible citizens and let's move towards a responsible society. It's a long way, but let's start going there, and let's stop othering this issue. Let's start looking inside our homes. Let's protect our children, and if it, even not our homes, then people who are around us, we can talk about it within our communities, within our society, uh, within our groups, when mothers talk to each other, when fathers talk to each other. As parents, we can talk, school needs to talk, we need to engage all the stakeholders together. So yeah, that's all I would like to conclude over here.
Thank you so much, Ayushi. Aakanksha?
But along with that, I want to add a few things. One is, I think, talk about it. Sure, we need to create a space where we can, have people where people, our peers, can openly, talk to us about things. But it is also very important to educate ourselves on the issue first. And I think in this time and age, I think it's not an excuse, because every information is available at the touch of a finger. It is very important for us to be educated about what is currently happening, what are the issues pertaining to it. If there are any questions, who can you go to, who can you reach out to? There are organizations working about this. Probably exposing yourself to that. Of course, it's something that is, unfortunately, it's a niche issue, but it's also something that happens very commonly across everywhere. So yes, talk about it, educate yourself about it, seek help for it, encourage people to seek help for it. And this is the narrative that has been going on even about suicide. But um, now that there is now, it doesn't end with educating yourself. I think it's also important to understand your limitations when it comes to reaching out to people. Like we said, we should reach out to people who share their experiences with us, but we may not be completely able to, give them the help that they need. So therefore, it's very important to help them to help themselves by accessing the right resources. But yes, aside from that, yes, we need to smash this aspect of patriarchy as well, and we need to talk about it more, and do whatever we can in our capacities. That's it.
Thank you, Akanksha. With this, we come to the end of our session. I cannot stress this enough. I know they have said this, but I will repeat this. Nevertheless, please talk about this at home, talk about this to your children, and not just to your children, but also to your friends, your parents, your cousins, your siblings, whoever you can find, because this is something that happens at home or in other safe spaces, which is why it has to be addressed at home and in these safe spaces. So with this, I would like to invite the final video that we play, and I will see you next Friday at 8 p.m. Thank you.
Almost all of us want to do something for the larger society and try to give back to our people. But we all have limitations. We see and feel for people in difficult circumstances, and we also know that the lives of people living in extreme poverty and in difficult conditions are inevitably bound with our own lives and identities. Let's come together, speak your mind, share your ideas, and together we can work to improve the lives of people in need. Join us for online meetings. Let's discuss and plan the way forward. As shall you use your expertise, so shall others, and together we can truly make a difference. Our target is to rescue women in slavery, women who are bought and sold like products in the market for the purpose of marriage. Women who are then mistreated and abandoned to their own devices due to lack of support from the family, the community, and society at large. They constitute a new generation of the oppressed. A denial of their basic human rights is the biggest threat to our development and sustainability as a species. As a first step, simply come and register at our website www.empowerpeople.in. Our team will get in touch with you. We look forward to seeing you join hands, hearts and minds with us. Add in your bid to keep the flame of compassion, service and humanity alive.